Hello and welcome back to the Underscored podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Kent, spokesperson and public relations manager for Young Voices. As you're listening to this, Nevada is voting or has just voted on a Democratic candidate to challenge Donald Trump in the 2020 election. This just days after a truly bitter debate, really nasty, between the last surviving candidates at the Paris in Las Vegas. So what a night it was for political junkies like myself. Here with me to go over the night's festivities are fellow junkies, Nate Hochman and Natalie Dowzicky of Young Voices. Welcome to you both. Natalie, I wanted to start with you. So much happened on stage in Vegas, sort of familiar to many of the past debates. What was new was Mike Bloomberg. I mean, he stepped down off of Mount Olympus and engaged the mortals in debate. and he kind of really just took like a shit ton of incoming fire. Did Bloomberg surprise you in any way for this debate, or was this kind of what you expected would happen?
So I'm going to say that I didn't have many expectations for Bloomberg going into the debate. I did have expectations that every other candidate was going to attack him as soon as they could. And obviously we saw Warren came out swinging first. And I think, to me, Bloomberg came off a little bit flat. Some of the questions that I know his team knew were coming to him, whether it was about the NDAs that were discussed, his tax returns. He didn't come off like he had a prepared answer. I don't know if you guys felt that way, but I just didn't feel like the obvious questions that he definitely should have prepared for and his team should have prepared him for. He didn't have all that well of answers. Especially, I don't know if you guys felt this way as well, but when it got to stop and frisk, which was obviously a huge issue in New York when Bloomberg was mayor, it didn't seem like he was well prepared to stand up for himself and apologize in a way that was like acceptable.
Yeah, I agree with Natalie. I don't know that anyone had particularly high expectations from Bloomberg's debate performance. He's not someone who necessarily exudes charisma, but I was shocked at just the complete flat-footedness with which he responded to the most predictable questions. I mean, when Elizabeth Warren came for him right off of the bat about, the comments that he allegedly made about women, and then NDAs, and then obviously stop and frisks. Those were all things that he and his team should have seen coming 3 miles away. And, with all the money that he has to spend, I would imagine that he has entire teams of people who have, whose entire jobs are to prepare him for these things. And yet he gave these tepid, completely unimpressive answers, and legitimately looked sort of shocked at times that people were coming at him. So I don't know if it was just the fact that he's not a good debater, or if his team, had some blind spots or what. But I was really surprised with just how unprepared and weak he looked throughout the entire debate.
Every candidate has different things in their background that they clearly have adjusted their views on. You could call that lying to the current audience to reflect new opinions. I think stop and frisk is one of those. I'm definitely not convinced that Mike Bloomberg is at all apologetic about the policy that he implemented in New York. And even in his answers on stage, he sort of vacillated between apologizing for its egregiousness and getting out of control, but also saying, hey, crime was out of control and I fixed it. Right. He said all of those things in one answer. And obviously, from a libertarian perspective, I find stop and frisk to be shrewd. I find it to be inappropriate. I find it to be wrong. But I also, maybe it's just like the politics guy in me. Like, I also just wonder if he should just own up to it and be like, yeah, I managed New York the best way it could be managed, and most people who live there thank me for it, and all of you are out of touch with people who actually live in those communities. What do you think? Am I totally off base there?
Honestly, I would have been much more satisfied with an answer like that, because all of us, or most of America, understands that New York City is probably one of the hardest cities to manage, or especially be mayor of. And I kind of don't like the fact that he was skirting around the issue. His answer was very much watered down and it didn't seem apologetic at all, to be honest. It sounded canned to the fact that he didn't realize maybe the gravity or how many people it actually affected. I mean, stop and frisk, especially in New York, it was unconstitutional, right? Even and including the fact that it was terrible. And I just don't think there's anything you can do to make it look better except own up for it. And everyone knew that this policy existed, and it's no surprise to any voters. And mind you, like Steven said, all of the candidates have stuff in their backgrounds that are unsavory. Biden's had to answer for some of those things, whether it was busing or the crime bills in the 90s. But I think something like this, you just own up to it. You don't skirt around the issue, especially a huge issue like this.
And he sort of struck this weird middle between apologizing and owning up to it, right? Like I mean, Mike Bloomberg is not someone who's necessarily known for being very good at apologizing for things. You know, his history is sort of the prototype of the billionaire playboy egomaniac. But he did this weird thing on Stop and Frisk where he had this kind of canned answer that he delivered incredibly half-heartedly about, I'm not incredibly proud of Stop and Frisk. It's the thing I'm most worried about in my past. But it wasn't a full-throated apology, and at the same time, it wasn't sort of what Stephen was talking about, where he was sort of just embraced it and said, "You guys weren't on the ground in New York. You didn't see how bad the crime was," and it was sort of the worst of both worlds in some ways. Because he looked
Charlie Cook over at National Review said, like, it fails to acknowledge that most voters have slightly totalitarian tendencies, and you should just be honest with them when you're like, "Yeah, I did that," and it turned out okay.
Yeah, it's a quintessential libertarian thing to say.
I also thought just going back to, he just has no charisma. His stage presence is just not good. I mean, and it was kind of shocking, right? Because we've seen he spent how much in ads, 400 million or something like that in ads. So I guess like that kind of built up. We're like, oh, he's going to have a presence on the stage, like maybe, but it just wasn't there at all.
Yeah, I'm on record, and I want to kick this back over to Nate. I apologize for interrupting you. I'm on record as having laughed at the idea of Bloomberg ever being a factor in this race, but now he is sort of in the top 3 for Nevada and South Carolina without even being on the ballot. He's just, he's polling well regardless. Did he advance his strategy of being a brokered convention candidate, Nate, or has that strategy been set back?
No, not at all. I mean, I've seen some commentators, I think, sort of half jokingly saying Bloomberg would have been better served just not showing up on the debate stage at all, or at least not showing up on the debate stage until after Super Tuesday. But I think there's something to that. I mean, the guy's stage presence, like Natalie was saying, is he's not a very likable person on stage. And when he's trying to sort of give these tepid, half-hearted responses to being hit for a variety of different things by all the other candidates, it doesn't help his case at all. Whereas when he can sort of hide behind the ads, he can give these incredibly well-funded, polished sort of versions of himself to voters, and that was working for him. I mean, he was skyrocketed to second in some polls, probably an average of about third in most of the polls. And he's the polling that has come out since the debate, he's fallen in pretty much every single poll. So just by polling alone, I think he probably would have been better served in all of the upcoming primaries if he had just not showed up on the debate stage at all, which is tough to admit for his team, but I think there's some truth to that.
Natalie, I want to ask you about Elizabeth Warren here real quick to kind of move us along in this large field of candidates. Granted, it's smaller than it has been in months past. So the eagerness in which Warren went after Bloomberg, to me, suggested that she is indeed flaming out. From the very first question toward Bloomberg, she shot up her hand and started waving it around. And she just waited there until she got called on to simply roll out some canned opposition research about some of his sexist comments towards people in the workplace. It was clearly a rehearsed moment for her. It kind of reeked of desperation. Do you think her campaign is reaching its expiration?
Look, it's no secret I'm not a Warren fan, but I
really?
Kind of felt, yeah, I know, shocker, spoiler. I did think it looked desperate, right? And I think to the extent that a lot of the candidates felt like the first thing they needed to do on the stage that night was to attack Bloomberg rather than get policy discussion in. Look, I had to live tweet this debate for work, and we were all joking that the first 30 minutes there was no substance to the conversation because we were just focusing on attacking Bloomberg. And from the Warren perspective, I mean, she's fallen significantly in the polls. I think she has a tough time differentiating herself from the other candidates, even though there's fewer now than there were before. She had much more momentum before. And I think, I mean, not based off of her comments that she made about Bloomberg's past, his sexist comments. Honestly, I was in her camp then when she was yelling at him about his NDAs and that we should know and we should understand what those are about, because I just don't think any of that is acceptable. Mind you, we do have someone sitting in the Oval Office now.
Just bad jokes he told that the people didn't like.
Right, bad jokes. Yeah, that was cringeworthy, and it was awkward, and it was just really bad. So like, I don't negate anything she was saying there or attacking in that way because it was true, but I just think she's holding on for dear life here, and I don't think she can differentiate herself enough from Bernie to really make a go for it. And I found it interesting. I think this debate and the debate before, there have been throughout the entire debates, there's been this like tension between discussing socialism and capitalism and discussing democratic socialism. And I think Warren hasn't come out, and all of those questions that have been asked around these topics hasn't come out different enough from Bernie in the discussion. And I remember on, it was Wednesday, what the debate was on Wednesday, that she just kind of was absent in that whole conversation when Bloomberg called Bernie a communist, and Bernie fought back. So I think her policy angles don't stick out enough, and it's going to be hard for her team to charge forward from there. Even though she had the most speaking time of that debate. I believe she came out on top, slightly over 15 minutes.
That doesn't surprise me because she's so assertive throughout the night in getting her speaking time regardless.
Yeah. Yep, she had like slightly over 15 minutes, and Klobuchar was right behind her.
Yeah. You know, Nate, that kind of just reminds me when she was talking about Bernie Sanders, he just feels increasingly inevitable. Like you can sense the angst from debate moderators and opponents across the stage, but nobody is willing to do anything about it, which would be to drop out. You know, we're kind of looking at the 2016 scenario here with Donald Trump. Do you think he's going to be the nominee?
I am loath to make any sort of electoral predictions, because if 2016 proved one thing, it was that punditry predictions are generally not always actually in sync with reality. But if I had to put a bet on anyone today, it would be Bernie Sanders. And it's, you brought up 2016. It's not a particularly original insight to compare Bernie to Trump. You know, they both have this very online base of sort of pseudo-religious followers. They're both sort of populists. They both view all of America's problems as stemming from this corrupt elite. But there's also the way that 2020 for the Democrats is panning out is remarkably similar to the way that 2016 panned out for is you have this field of qualified candidates, but everyone and their mother is running for the nomination. And what that does is it splits the sort of majority of the vote between a bunch of different candidates, and nobody wants to drop out because the parties and institutions are weaker than they've ever been, and they don't really have any say over those things anymore. And then you've got this sort of populist candidate who doesn't have a majority. I mean, people forget Trump, going into the 2016, at the very end of the Republican primary, he still only got 45% of the popular vote from the Republican base. But he had, and that was after he consolidated, power, because Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz both stayed in too long. But it's the same thing with Bernie Sanders, where he has a plurality. He's, mid to low 20s, depending which polls you're looking at, which is far from a majority. A lot of Democrats are still pretty uncomfortable with his radical brand of politics. But because he's got this ardent base of followers, and there's so many other candidates in the field still, and nobody will drop out, he, could cruise to the nomination with far from a majority, because he has a really loyal following, and everyone else is split up amongst all of the other candidates.
I think that's exactly right. I think part of it as well, I mean, I'm also very hesitant to predict anything. I know that it's going to be challenging, even if Bernie is the clear nominee, for the Democratic Party to accept that. And I mean, I don't want to sound like I have little conspiracies about what goes on behind closed doors, but I just don't think. I think it's going to take a lot. Bernie's going to have to prove himself way more than another candidate is going to have to prove himself in order to secure that nomination. And I think throughout these debates, a lot of the other candidates have tried to say that they're the real Democrat, right? We saw that in this last debate. Buttigieg came out and said that he's the only Democrat on the stage because there's socialists on one side and Bloomberg's the Republican on the stage.
That was a pretty good remark.
Yeah,
it
was excellent, and it was very well timed in the discussion they were having as well. And I think we're going to continue to see remarks like that that are going to try to paint to voters that like Bernie isn't actually a Democrat, which I mean they aren't wrong, but I think Bernie's team is going to have to consistently fight that, especially as more and more people drop out, because whoever's between Bernie and Bernie getting the nomination, they are going to ride that horse all the way to the end, discussing about how Bernie is not a true Democrat. So
I was just going to say, I think, the Democrats are sort of between a rock and a hard place right now. And I'm certainly not envious of Tom Perez, because I think, the Bernie bros, quote unquote, are prone to conspiracy theories, and they have an enormous amount of sort of built up grievance against the Democratic Party, partially for legitimate reasons. But if Bernie wins the nomination, there's serious concerns about his electability. Nominating a mentally unstable septuagenarian socialist to sort of be the person who's going to take on Donald Trump in the middle of the country is probably not the best electoral strategy. But if he doesn't win the nomination, there's a pretty significant portion of the Democratic base, around 20%, give or take, who are going to be really upset with the Democratic establishment and might sort of just throw up their hands in disgust and not vote for a Democrat at all. People forget in 2016, 7% of the Bernie Sanders voters flipped and went for Trump, which is not an insignificant number. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was more this time, if not people voting for Trump, than people defecting from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, Nate, you've written a lot in the past about some of the fringe and harmful positions that Democrats have taken in this election cycle on matters from, government paid childcare to healthcare to free college. Has anything in the last week come up that you thought pushed the field further to the left? Because it does seem at this point they're about as far out as they can go, but it's also all at this point devolved to personal attacks, with the exception of litigating socialism as a term.
Well, it depends who the Democrats nominate. But in general, I think because the party's been pushed so far to the left, it's going to be really difficult for a lot of the candidates to sort of do the classic pivot back to the center. Now, Obama didn't really pivot back to the center in 2008, but he was the first candidate to do that. It's generally a winning electoral strategy. But especially on the progressive wing, if you look at people like Warren and Sanders, a lot of what they're promising is quite literally never going to happen. They're talking about Medicare for all, even though it's not supported by the majority of the Democrats in Congress right now, let alone the Republicans. They're talking about paying for things like universal child care with a wealth tax, which is dubious as to whether or not it's constitutional and probably wouldn't make it through the Supreme Court, even if the Democrats got a majority in the Senate and the House. So there's a variety of different things that they're talking about, but I think if the Democrats nominate a progressive like Warren or Sanders, one of the main things that I think they'll get hit for by the Republicans is just the fact that what they're talking about is completely unrealistic.
I agree with that too. And I think we would be remiss not to mention the fact that in the last week, especially with this big votes happening today and tomorrow, that there has been no discussion, not at this debate at all, of foreign policy. And we've all heard Bernie yell how he was against the war in Iraq and that he's good on foreign policy. The only question you could categorize under foreign policy at all during this week's debate was the question that Amy got about how she forgot the president of Mexico's name. There was no discussion about trade. There was no discussion about anything going on in the Middle East. And I think I think, yes, that falls on the moderators of the debate somewhat, but at the same time, the commander in chief is arguably the most powerful position the president has, and we got zero meaningful discussion this week about that at all.
This may be an impossible question, but this is a libertarian podcast. Was there anything in the most recent debate, or if you need the Democratic campaign recently in general, that gives you some hope or silver lining when it comes to our ideas, libertarian thought? I could go first and just say I am impressed. I am impressed at how long the Democrats have held the line against democratic socialism as a banner that they want to willingly carry. And maybe you could go from that to just sort of maybe looking at the campaign as like a breakdown of the two-party system in general. But Natalie, feel free to lead us off with silver lining.
Okay, there was a silver lining. I remember writing this down too. So in the last debate, when they were talking about the socialism capitalism divide, there were some candidates, and it was not just Bloomberg. I believe it was Klobuchar too, who said they did believe in capitalism, and that it wasn't. And I think
that's the bar.
I know, right? We're setting a very low bar, but it is a silver lining that we acknowledge that capitalism exists and that has given good things, whether it be to our economy or our markets or our style of life. And that was kind of nice to see. And I think it also separated out those who think their ideas are supportive of capitalism and those who know they are. Because as you notice, Warren didn't say anything about capitalism, and Klobuchar came out saying, well, I am also a capitalist. I believe in capitalism. But then again, that is setting the bar kind of low. But it was nice to see a discussion that capitalism exists. And it's not all doom and gloom like they always tend to.
Mike Bloomberg, should you exist?
That question was funny too.
Nate, what's on your mind?
Yes, I mean, I guess the cause for optimism isn't actually any particular political developments in the Democratic Party, because I think for anyone who cares about things like individual liberty or just basic notions of constitutional democracy and pluralism, the Democratic Party is increasingly sort of antithetical to a lot of those ideas. But I think what I would say, the reason that I probably am not pulling my hair out about the prospect of a Bernie Sanders candidacy, like I think a lot of folks on the right are, is just because one of the central insights of our constitutional design is that it's really tough to pass sort of these major government expanding bills. It's been made easier by the expansion of the bureaucracy in the executive branch, but the Democrats were fighting for what eventually materialized to become the Affordable Care Act for 4 decades, basically since LBJ, and it took them a really long time to get it through. So most of the sort of things that Democrats, especially the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, are promising, like I mentioned earlier, if I hesitate to say they're never going to happen because I don't want to jinx anything, but it's going to be really, really difficult for them to pass any of the things that they want to get passed. So I'm not that concerned about, someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren making it to the presidency. Obviously, I'd rather they didn't, but I don't think that they present quite the threat to individual liberty that it might seem like to some people who watch these debates.
Well, it may be the end of the world,
right,
and Nate Hochman feels fine. So that's all that counts. All right, Natalie Dowzicky, Nate Hochman, thank you so much for joining Underscore today to reflect on the Democratic debate. I think next week when we have the podcast, we'll have a winner of the Nevada Caucuses. We'll be headed towards South Carolina. And then Super Tuesday, what a time to be alive. It's 2020. This has been Underscored episode 35. I've been your host, Stephen Kent. You can find me on Twitter at Stephen_Kent89 and Young Voices at YVADV. And I'll leave links to our guests, Nate Hochman and Natalie Dowzicky, in the show notes. We'll be back next week with more. And until then, stay free.